You know, when you're a peace activist, people come to you and you talk how we can promote peace, and they say, well, there's never been peace. People are always going to fight. Well, sometimes it's hard to have comebacks for that, but this talk is a TED Talk by a woman by the name of Jamila Raquib. She's with the Einstein Institute, and she gave one of the best TED Talks I ever heard about how to promote nonviolent action and leading to social justice. It's only 9 minutes long, so I would like you to listen to this talk. And I don't know how to turn these lights off, Peter.
I don't either.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll just do the best we can. Okay. Here's Jamila Raquib.
Guys, hang on, guys. Oh.
War has been a part of my life since I can remember. I was born in Afghanistan, just 6 months after the Soviets invaded. And even though I was too young to understand what was happening, I had a deep sense of the suffering and the fear around me. Those early experiences had a major impact on how I now think about war and conflict. I learned that when people have a fundamental issue at stake, for most of them, giving in is not an option. For these types of conflicts, when people's rights are violated, when their countries are occupied, when they're oppressed and humiliated, they need a powerful way to resist and to fight back. Which means that no matter how destructive and terrible violence is, if people see it as their only choice, they will use it. Most of us are concerned with the level of violence in the world. But we're not going to end war by telling people that violence is morally wrong. Instead, we must offer them a tool that's at least as powerful and as effective as violence. This is the work I do. For the past 13 years, I've been teaching people in some of the most difficult situations around the world how they can use nonviolent struggle to conduct conflict. Most people associate this type of action with Gandhi and Martin Luther King. But people have been using nonviolent action for thousands of years. In fact, most of the rights that we have today in this country, as women, as minorities, as workers, as people of different sexual orientations, and citizens concerned with the environment, these rights weren't handed to us. They were won by people who fought for them and who sacrificed for them. But because we haven't learned from this history, nonviolent struggle as a technique is widely misunderstood. I met recently with a group of Ethiopian activists, and they told me something that I hear a lot. They said they'd already tried nonviolent action and it hadn't worked. Years ago, they held a protest. The government arrested everyone, and that was the end of that. The idea that nonviolent struggle is equivalent to street protests is a real problem. Because although protests can be a great way to show that people want change, on their own, they don't actually create change. At least change that is fundamental. Powerful opponents are not going to give people what they want just because they ask nicely, or even not so nicely. Nonviolent struggle works by destroying an opponent, not physically, but by identifying the institutions that an opponent needs to survive, and then denying them those sources of power. Nonviolent activists can neutralize the military by causing soldiers to defect. They can disrupt the economy through strikes and boycotts. And they can challenge government propaganda by creating alternative media. There are a variety of methods that can be used to do this. My colleague and mentor, Gene Sharp, has identified 198 methods of nonviolent action. And protest is only one. Let me give you a recent example. Until a few months ago, Guatemala was ruled by corrupt former military officials with ties to organized crime. People were generally aware of this, but most of them felt powerless to do anything about it. Until one group of citizens, just 12 regular people, put out a call on Facebook to their friends to meet in the Central Plaza holding signs with a message, "Renuncia ya," resign already. To their surprise, 30,000 people showed up. They stayed there for months as protests spread throughout the country. At one point, the organizers delivered hundreds of eggs to various government buildings with a message. If you don't have the huevos, the balls, to stop corrupt candidates from running for office, you can borrow ours. President Molina responded by vowing that he would never step down. And the activists realized that they couldn't just keep protesting and ask the president to resign. They needed to leave him no choice. So they organized a general strike in which people throughout the country refused to work. In Guatemala City alone, over 400 businesses and schools shut their doors. Meanwhile, farmers throughout the country blocked major roads. Within 5 days, the president, along with dozens of other government officials, resigned already. I've been greatly inspired by the creativity and bravery of people using nonviolent action in nearly every country in the world. For example, recently a group of activists in Uganda released a crate of pigs in the streets. You can see here that the police are confused about what to do with them. The pigs were painted the color of the ruling party. One pig was even wearing a hat that people recognized. Activists around the world are getting better at grabbing headlines, but these isolated actions do very little if they're not part of a larger strategy. A general wouldn't march his troops into battle unless he had a plan to win the war. Yet this is how most of the world's nonviolent movements operate. Nonviolent struggle is just as complex as military warfare, if not more. Its participants must be well-trained and have clear objectives, and its leaders must have a strategy of how to achieve those objectives. The technique of war has been developed over thousands of years, with massive resources and some of our best minds dedicated to understanding and improving how it works. Meanwhile, nonviolent struggle is rarely systematically studied, and even though the number is growing, there are still only a few dozen people in the world who are teaching it. This is dangerous because we now know that our old approaches of dealing with conflict are not adequate for the new challenges that we're facing. The US government recently admitted that it's in a stalemate in its war against ISIS. But what most people don't know is that people have stood up to ISIS using nonviolent action. When ISIS captured Mosul in June 2014, they announced that they were putting in place a new public school curriculum based on their own extremist ideology. But on the first day of school, not a single child showed up. Parents simply refused to send them. And they told journalists they would rather homeschool their children than to have them brainwashed. This is an example of just one act of defiance in just one city. But what if it was coordinated with the dozens of other acts of nonviolent resistance that have taken place against ISIS? What if the parents' boycott was part of a larger strategy to identify and cut off the resources that ISIS needs to function? The skilled labor needed to produce food. The engineers needed to extract and refine oil. The media infrastructure and communications networks and transportation systems, and the local businesses that ISIS relies on. It may be difficult to imagine defeating ISIS with action that is nonviolent. But it's time that we challenge the way we think about conflict and the choices we have in facing it. Here's an idea worth spreading. Let's learn more about where nonviolent action has worked and how we can make it more powerful, just like we do with other systems and technologies that are constantly being refined to better meet human needs. It may be that we can improve nonviolent action to a point where it is increasingly used in place of war. Violence as a tool of conflict could then be abandoned in the same way that bows and arrows were, because we have replaced them with weapons that are more effective. With human innovation, we can make nonviolent struggle more powerful than the newest and latest technologies of war. The greatest hope for humanity lies not in condemning violence, but in making violence obsolete. Thank you.
mic here, so, oh, there we go. So nonviolence will work. We know that. Well, we're at towards the end of our program, and last but not least, I'm really excited about our next speaker. He is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice in New York, at the New York University School of Law, and he formerly worked with the FBI for 16 years as an undercover agent, covering terrorism, domestic terrorism, and covert operations. But he left the FBI in 2004 because of the serious deficiencies in the FBI's counterintelligence programs. And he actually spoke before Congress about these failings, and he left more or less in protest of the way the FBI was operating. Mr. German has also served as a policy counsel for the National Security and Privacy for the ACLU and the Legislative Office in Washington D.C. He was, as I said, an FBI undercover agent, but also he was an instructor of counterterrorism. He's taught courses on extremism and domestic societies to law enforcement agencies. He's written a book. The first book he wrote was Thinking Like a Terrorist, Insights of a Former FBI Undercover Agent, and was published in 2007. We're very excited that he's going to speak to us today, and the title of his speech will be The Failure of Our Counterintelligence Discourse. So please welcome Mr. Michael German.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate it. And thanks so much for inviting me to come and speak to you and to be part of this really incredible day. I feel a little bit nervous about following such a great talk this morning, and of course a great band this afternoon. So I hope you can bear with me, and we can try to learn something about terrorism. I should probably know something about it, since that's pretty much where I've spent the last 25 years of my life, trying to figure out this problem. And I started studying terrorism in somewhat of a unusual way. I mean, I grew up, my mother's side of the family was Irish Catholic during the 1970s, so all those songs of rebellion that we heard this afternoon were part of the terrorism as I understood it. You know, the battles between the IRA and the British government, and the Protestant paramilitaries that were involved in that conflict. So I tried really hard to understand what was going on there, and you know, we talked about it as a nation in a very different way, right? I mean, growing up Irish Catholic and going to Irish bars, there was a little green bucket at the end of the bar, and people would throw their change or a few loose bills into it, and nobody thought anything of it, even though everybody knew where that bucket was going, and that it was going to help fuel one side or the other in these conflicts, depending on which side the Irish bar was in. And we understood it as a political conflict, right? There weren't these self-appointed experts that Todd talked about this morning who went over the Bible to try to understand how the Christian doctrine could create the IRA and the horrific violence that's being used, or what's wrong with the way Protestants read the Bible that would allow the Protestant paramilitaries to engage in such horrible violence, right? We didn't see this as a religious struggle. We understood it as what it was, a political struggle, right? Somewhat what Todd talked about this morning. The dispute wasn't over who was what church you were going to go into to pray, right? It was who controls this piece of land. And the disputes today are no different. But somehow the discourse, the way we talk about these political conflicts is much different. So when Bill invited me to come and talk, and said that the focus was going to be on the definition of terrorism, that sort of struck me, because when I first went undercover in the early 90s, I was trying to read everything I could, right? I'd graduated from Northwestern Law School, so I had a little bit of roots here in the Midwest, But then they sent me out to Los Angeles during a period of time where a bunch of smart politicians figured that what we needed to do is deregulate the savings and loans and let them go out and make money like everybody else does. And of course, they did. They made money like crooks, and it unfortunately cost the taxpayers of the United States a little bit over $2 billion in the fraud that they committed. And interestingly, back then, the FBI and the Justice Department actually activated and put them in jail. So I spent the first portion of my career working on that, these big bank cases, and was looking for a new challenge and something different. And luckily in the FBI, you don't have to change jobs to do a different job. And a colleague of mine walks into the office one day and he said, you know, I'm starting a case targeting white supremacist skinheads, and you have blonde hair and blue eyes, so you can be a Nazi. And that was basically all the training that I had, to go and portray myself as a Nazi, working undercover in these groups to try to uncover illegal weapons trafficking and explosives manufacturing. So I was feeling a little prepared for this, so I started reading everything I could on terrorism to try to understand it. And most of the academic literature about terrorism was trying to define it, right? Because we can't understand a phenomenon unless we can define it. It was quite frustrating to somebody going in where I don't, that kind of academic discourse was not helpful to me at all, right? Because I have to understand how this actually works on the ground, how these terrorists actually use this tactic. And so I would be very quiet when I first started the undercover operation and would meet people. And luckily, what they have in these groups are probably the best terrorism instructors in the world, right? Because they're actually terrorists and they know what they're doing. And I was shocked that they would hand me manuals. They would hand me instructional materials. They would give me VHS tapes. Remember when we had those? VHS tapes and say, this is what it's about. This is how we do it. And it was shocking to me that I had read all this academic material trying to understand this phenomenon, and they published material. They published material that explained their tactics. And I was in groups that were on the far right, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, anti-government militias. But the tactics that they used were taken from Brazilian communist terrorists and Irish nationalist terrorists and any kind of terrorist in the world, because it's not about the ideology, right? This is a tactic. It's a tactic that is used by groups who don't have military power, right? So if there's a group that is going to use violence against the government and they have tanks and planes, what do we call them? We call them the rebel general, right? It's only when they don't have tanks and planes that they have to rely on some other kind of methodology that they become a terrorist. Similarly, if a group has political power, they don't need to resort to violence in order to achieve their goals, right? They can do what the latest speaker said, use those tools of nonviolent organizing and activism to get the social change, the political change you're looking for. It's only when you don't have that political support and you don't have that military capability that you resort to this tactic. So that's what I thought in my training as a law enforcement officer was what we used to call a clue, right? That means that these groups are extremely weak, right? The only reason a group would resort to a tactic like this is that they are coming from a position of extreme weakness. And what I learned reading the manuals that they gave me was the methodology of terrorism was designed to provoke the government or whoever they're attacking, whatever force they're going against, to provoke that government to take actions against its own interests, right? So it's just a trick. That's all it is, and it's using horrific violence usually against a target that will bring tremendous empathy. And the idea is to make them so mad they go crazy and they start doing things that are against their interests. So when I taught terrorism at the FBI National Academy and then at the National Defense University, I would get a class full of law enforcement officers, intelligence officers, military officers, and I would say, okay, we are going to become a terrorist organization. We are going to be clandestine. There's only 10 or 20 or 30 of us against a government of incredible power who's got a military might that we can't even imagine having to wrestle with. So we're going to have to do this very stealthily. It's treason. We will be hung for our actions if we do this. What's the first thing we need to do? Anybody have a guess? What's the first thing the terrorist group needs to do? Publish a manifesto. Right? As an undercover agent, I can tell you, I would have been very upset if the FBI published the fact that it put an undercover agent out in a group, right? So why would a group that is engaged in a clandestine battle going to publish a manifesto? And these are typically read all the same, whether it's Al-Qaeda or the IRA or the mini manual of the urban guerrilla or the Weather Underground. The manifestos all read the same way. They have an indictment, right? This is what the government has done. They have all the legitimate means they tried to use to change the system and how they failed, and that this is a last resort, right? They're making basically what amounts to, in my legal training, a self-defense argument, right? That, you know, we tried to convince you what you were doing wrong. We used all the methods that you gave to us. Those failed, so now we have to defend ourselves, and therefore our violence is legitimate. Our violence is legitimate because it's necessary. You, the government, have done this. And then it does the most important thing for the terrorists. It identifies the community that they represent, right? Now, they didn't go out and do a poll of this community and say, hey, would you like us to represent you? You know, most of the people they claim to represent, they've never met before. So what's the purpose of their claim to represent this particular community? Anybody know? So the government knows who to suppress. So their provocation is designed to create government action against the community they have identified as theirs, with the idea that if the government then starts suppressing that community, totally unfairly, the community had nothing to do with electing this terrorist group to represent them, had nothing to do with approving their methodology. It was all intended to create government suppression of the community they have claimed to represent, so that the legitimate grievance builds up. So that once that legitimate grievance starts building in the community, who does that community turn to for support? The group that's already militarized. So it's this incredible methodology that requires the more powerful government they're attacking to do what they want it to do. And they've published their method, right? So it would be like you're a football team, and you know you're playing up for the University of Minnesota, and you're playing against Northwestern, one of the most powerful football teams in the country, and you have this brand new idea for an offense, and you say, okay, the center is going to hike the ball to the quarterback, and all the linemen are going to lie down on the ground, except for one wide receiver who's going to run all the way down the field. And the defense will be so confused that they'll just stand around looking at one another and we'll throw a touchdown pass. And by the way, we've given our game plan to Northwestern University. What are the chances of that succeeding, right? It's crazy. And yet, whether it's, you know, pick your terrorist conflict, whether it's Northern Ireland that we talked, or that the band played those beautiful songs about, you know, it works over and over again. It works, and there's a couple of reasons for that. But from a counterterrorist perspective, that's where I feel that the public discourse has failed us as a nation. Today, so this summer will be 15 years after we've declared the prevention of terrorism the #1 goal of the United States, right? We have spent $1.7 trillion in that effort up until now. And our main antagonist is a group, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, that didn't exist when we started.
That's Obama's fault.
It's a lot of people's fault, but that again is what in law enforcement we call a clue that what we're doing isn't as effective as it needs to be. Deanna Clapper, just last month, the Director of National Intelligence, testified before Congress, boasting of the military successes we're having against ISIS in Iraq and Syria and the substantial gains that we've had in that conflict. But then he said this, that these gains, quote, have not reduced the group's terrorism capabilities or global reach. Right. So, astonishing admission that what we're doing is not actually addressing the problem we're claiming it's there to address. Worse, there was a report out this spring, this spring, that the Taliban now controls more territory than at any time since the invasion in 2001. Again, this is the longest conflict our country has ever been involved in, and yet we're no closer to solving that problem than we were before we spent $1.7 trillion. And as far as the public discourse, Americans' fear of terrorism is high as it's been since 2005, shortly after the 9/11 attacks, even though there has been nothing anywhere close to that level of violence. And it's funny how we talk about terrorism. I had a reporter call me after the shooting in San Bernardino, and he said, is this level of terrorist violence just something that we're going to have to get used to as a nation? And I said, well, actually, you realize that terrorism was a much bigger problem in the United States in the 1970s. And he said, well, what do you mean much bigger problem? I said, there were far more terrorist attacks and far more Americans dying in terrorist attacks in the 1970s than over the past 10 years. And there was a moment of silence, and he said, well, but is this the level of violence we're just going to have to get used to? And I said, well, it should be easy to get used to a lower level of violence, right? We talk about terrorism as if it is a bigger problem, a problem that is new, a problem that the United States has never faced before, rather than acknowledging that this is actually one of the safest periods in the United States from terrorism. And that a lot of the effort we're spending is not actually addressing the violence that's actually plaguing our society. And the discourse coming from both the government and the media that likes this sensationalized reporting, and again, what Todd talked about this morning, the way that they build up the divisions in society. Because again, if we look at this from the terrorist perspective, looking at the terrorist manual, what did they want? They wanted the American public to be in fear, and they wanted the American public to be divided. So far, I think they're accomplishing their goals, and that's easy after something as horrific as 9/11, right? It's easy to instill fear, but that was almost 15 years ago, and the levels of fear are higher than they've been since 2005. So there's clearly something wrong with the way we talk about terrorism. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. has been a tremendous amount of funding of terrorism studies, right? Guess who the biggest funder of terrorism studies is? United States government, right? Governments are always the biggest investors in research about things they're concerned about. So the US government is funding this research, and there are, how many terrorism experts do we have in the room? How many of you want to be terrorism experts? Here's how you do it. This is the official way you get qualified as a terrorism expert in the United States. So say your name, and then say, I am a terrorism expert. And so all of these people who are self-proclaimed terrorism experts have stood up and created this industry of whether they're psychologists who talk about it from a psychological perspective, or political people who talk about it from a political perspective, that they're sort of manipulating the situation to their own biases rather than actually objectively studying this information. In 2009, the George Mason University Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, which is an organization that is trying to basically take all the myths out of law enforcement and actually look at something in the terrorism research community that's a dirty word, data, looked at terrorism research and found that there's a tiny percentage that actually uses data or actually uses legitimate social science methodology. So it's this faux academic community that is producing a tremendous amount of material, and it's divided into two schools. And actually, it's always been divided into two schools. In the 1980s, late 80s and 90s, when I first started looking at terrorism, it was divided into schools that were led by political scientists on the one hand and psychologists on the other hand. So the psychologists were arguing that this must be some mental process, some psychological failing that would allow somebody to do something so horrible, such terrible kinds of violence that terrorists engage in. And even worse, when they kill themselves to kill others. You know, this has to come from some kind of psychological defect. The political scientists said, no, these are political conflicts, and we can't understand any one actor's use of violence without conditioning it around all the other violence, right? If their government is violent, you can imagine that there is going to be a violent response to that government's violence, and that this is something that you have to understand holistically. So if you're the government and you're trying to find a quick and easy answer, which one are you going to fund? Right? Find the mental defect. That's what got funded. So 20 years of research went into trying to find the mental defect that allowed people to be terrorists. And they started interviewing terrorists who had been captured or who had retired. There's actually a cadre of retired terrorists out there. And shockingly, what they found was not only is there not a profile of the terrorist psychological makeup, but there is very low incidence of any psychological illness or defect. In fact, much lower than the general population, which you can only understand if you've ever been in a terrorist group, right? This is highly complex behavior. You have to be very secretive. You can only work with the people you absolutely trust. Obviously, the terrorists I worked with picked the wrong guy. But it's complex behavior, and the last thing you want engaged in that kind of clandestine activity is somebody who has mental health problems, right? So those people get weeded out pretty quickly, and they aren't part of organized terrorist groups. So what does the government do when it comes through 20 years of funding this research, and now there's an even bigger terrorism problem to solve once the 9/11 attacks happen? What do they now fund? Do they say, okay, the psychologists were wrong, the political scientists were right, we have to understand the political situation in these countries where we're engaged in terrorism conflicts? No, they reached even deeper into history and pulled out this theory of radicalization. Right, and you know, the conversation today has been so great because we've covered a lot of these things. I don't know how many of you are Congress watchers. My wife and I lived in D.C. for 10 years, so it was sort of, you know, it was our sports. We didn't have sports in D.C. We had what's going on in Congress. But many of you have probably seen these hearings on radical Islam, right? Have you seen any of this? I'm sorry?
We had a trial.
Right. I'm talking about hearings in Congress. The first radicalization hearing in Congress, anybody know which one that was? It's 1917. It had nothing to do with the Middle East. It was radicals who were involved in the anti-war movement, right? Because in World War I, there was efforts by peace activists to create a conscientious objector pathway for people to escape the draft, to oppose the draft. And the way the government figured it was, if the Germans and the Japanese are fighting a war against the United States, and there are people in the United States who oppose war, they must be in it together, right? That it's these ideas that these academics and clergy and journalists are propagating about labor rights, about peace, about these other issues that are the problem. The enemy we can defeat militarily. We don't have to worry about that, especially by 1917 when the war was coming to a close. But it's that those ideas are still here. They have crossed the international boundary, and it's the ideas that we have to defeat. And this newly founded organization called the Bureau of Investigation that I later worked for set about identifying all the radicals. And they went out and collected these huge lists of radicals. And in 1919 started rounding them up in what became known as the Palmer raids, and arrested 10,000 people and put them up for deportation. Surprisingly, the amount of terrorist violence continued. And in fact, they found no terrorists. They found a couple of rifles, but were later found to be theater props and weren't actually real rifles. So this methodology of identifying the people who have bad ideas and then trying to collect them all up is a terribly ineffective methodology, and we should learn from that. And of course, this radicalization concept was brought out again during the Cold War. It was brought out during the Civil Rights struggle with this idea that if somebody who is moving or advocating on behalf of whatever political goal it is engages in violence, everybody who engages with that ideology or that political activism is in league with them. And it's guilt by association that allows them to collect these huge communities that they then try to suppress. So this concept of radicalization had been out there for some time. And after the search for a mental illness fell apart, they came up with this concept of radicalization again and created a very simple 4-step pathway from adopting an ideology to becoming a terrorist. And it was considered a conveyor belt or a funnel that once you adopt a particular ideology, eventually you're going to become a terrorist. So therefore, if you're a counterterrorist, if you're an FBI agent like me, it's really, luckily, knock wood, terrorism is still extremely rare in the United States. So it's very hard to go out there and predict who's going to commit a crime and find them. But who's easy to find, right? Activist communities, you're easy to find, right? Yeah, all you have to do is go on the web. They knew, the whole world knew, including the FBI and all the intelligence, that we were having this meeting. So if you are concerned that somebody who, and as expressed, the National Guard in California in 2005 was was caught spying on an anti-war protest there. And one of the government officials said, well, if you're engaged in a war against terrorism and somebody is opposing that war, they must be in league with the terrorists. They must be supporting the terrorists. So, you know, it's this mentality that creates this idea that it's the radicals that we're looking for, right? So they keep trying to promote this concept of radical Islam, right? And that's what Todd talked about this morning, this professional network of Islamophobic groups that are trying to promote this, along with a lot of politicians who are continuing to do this. And it's fascinating. I mean, one of the things, again, with the counterterrorism discourse that's so troubling to me is how afactual it is, right? So they would argue that radical Islam encompasses groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hezbollah. Okay, anybody know enough about terrorism to identify the problem? Al-Qaeda and ISIS are Sunni Muslim, Hezbollah is Shia Muslim, so they're actually enemies. But they go further than that. It's also Saudi Arabia and Iran. Again, a Sunni Muslim split, but also, again, if you look at Syria and Iraq right now, these groups are all fighting one another, right? These groups are in active conflict with one another. So this concept that they're all in league together sort of falls apart there, doesn't it? It from a factual basis. But even if you believe, well, okay, you know, take out the Shia groups, you know, if you look at Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Saudi Arabia, their theologies are remarkably similar. And yet they're slaughtering each other every day in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why is that? Because it has nothing to do with the theology or the ideology. It has to do with who controls this piece of land. And if we started looking at these problems that way, we would be able to address them much easier and actually try to resolve these conflicts. Because it's the conflict that is continuing to perpetuate the violence rather than the violence justifying the conflict. You know, if I had a magic button today and was able to push it and every single member of ISIS would fall dead to the ground, you would still have a remarkably bloody conflict going on in Syria and Iraq, right? When you talk to Americans about what they know about ISIS, it is basically one thing they know about ISIS: to be deadly afraid of it, right? How many people trained in Iraq and Syria came to the United States and killed someone? None, right? Not a single instance you could point to. It's this strange fear that is irrational to what the situation is. But again, it's perpetuated by this discourse that we have that fails, in my opinion, because it doesn't inform, right? One of my favorite people in history is James Madison, and you know what he argued was a popular government without public information is a prelude to a tragedy or a farce. And that's where we find ourselves, because we have a public that is in fear but doesn't have information to understand what the threat is or to evaluate what the government's actually doing, right? Because you would think that when a director of national intelligence who has been in power for many years now and responsible for this conflict would stand before Congress after spending $1.7 trillion and say, yeah, we haven't actually touched their ability to commit terrorism, that the next thing would be Congress demanding some kind of changing of the guard over these matters, but it doesn't. You know, it's just perpetual, and that's where I think it's necessary for this community in particular to look at these issues in a different way, because this radicalization thing that they're talking about right now is most heavily being weighted against the Muslim community, which it was the subject of Todd's talk this morning. And so because they're the top of the funnel, right? Becoming a Muslim is step one, according to this radicalization theory, to becoming a terrorist. So if you're a counter-terrorist, you're going to go look at that community. So that community starts feeling the suppression of constant surveillance, of being infiltrated with informants, and even worse, agents provocateur who are trying to provoke crime that doesn't yet exist. But that's not the only community it's happening to. And one of the reasons, we talked at the end of Todd's talk about how our communities could engage better with Muslim communities. This is actually the best way to do it, because we are in this together, right? Because this radicalization theory, there are people who have used violence in the name of anti-war, in the name of stopping war, right? Not a long time, thankfully, but that's historical context is all the government needs to justify spying on the anti-war community, right? And to justify spying, it was amazing how the government looks at violence differently. And again, this came up with Todd, where he talked about Dylan Roof a little bit. Dylan Roof is the person who shot 9 people in Charleston, South Carolina at the First AME Church, or the Mother Emanuel AME Church. And the FBI director has said twice that he doesn't believe that's terrorism, right? That the government somehow doesn't view, and the FBI actually has a definition of terrorism in statute, which says, it's an act of violence or threatened violence to achieve a political or social goal or intimidate a civilian population. If you go as a white person into a black church and ask for the reverend, who is a very prominent person in that church and a sitting state legislator, that's a pretty good clue that that was a politically motivated act. And clearly intended to intimidate the larger black community in Charleston. So how, if you're going to have a definition, you wouldn't apply it? But it actually makes sense with the history of terrorism, because governments tend to view revolutionary violence, violence that challenges the status quo, differently from reactionary violence, violence that tends to reinforce the status quo, right? That's why the Ku Klux Klan was able to exist, committing incredible violence for many, many years, and today still isn't considered the same type of threat that Al-Qaeda or ISIS does, even though white supremacist groups kill more Americans than far-right groups kill more Americans than any other group on an average year in the United States. Obviously, 9/11 was an outlier in that. So you would think that would be higher on the register, but it's not. And in fact, in 2005, the FBI treated all Muslim violence as international terrorism, right? Even if you were born right here and never left right here, you're still an international terrorist if you're Muslim. And if you're white, if you were born in Canada and grew up in Europe, but committed an act of violence here, that's domestic terrorism. None of it makes sense. But they said the #1 domestic terrorist threat is, anybody guess?
United States government?
No. The environmental rights movement. The environmental rights movement. So, anybody know how many people have been killed by environmental rights extremists in the United States? Again, 0. But for years, the FBI would say environmental rights extremists are the #1 domestic terrorism threat. It's interesting, when I worked at the ACLU, we did a Freedom of Information Act for FBI training materials, and in the materials on animal rights activists, I was looking at it because I wanted to see what acts of violence they were pointing to, and one of the slides said, one of the methods that animal rights terrorists use is the Freedom of Information Act. Right? They didn't like getting Freedom of Information Act requests from animal rights activists who felt they were being spied on, so they would file a Freedom of Information Act request to try to get the evidence that they were being spied on, and that reinforced in the FBI's mind that, oh, this is a new tactic of the terrorists, rather than realizing that somebody's probably not going to put a return address envelope on a request if they're actually a terrorist. So again, it's this, looking at something that's challenging the status quo is seen as dangerous by the government. Reactionary violence is seen as just criminal, nothing to get excited about, even though far more Americans are being killed there. Not to mention, if you took all the terrorism committed in an average year, it would be far less than the 15,000 homicides that are committed each year, right? It was interesting, I was called to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing by Senator Cruz on radical Islam, and by the time we were going to talk about a horrific event that, the Orlando shooting where 49 Americans were killed, horrible event. But by the time we testified, that made up less than 1% of the murders committed in the United States so far that year. Right? So this is a tiny amount of the violence that's plaguing our community that we, as a society, ignore. And particularly as a law enforcement community, they ignore. Half of the violent crime in the United States goes unsolved every year. Remarkably consistently. More than half goes unsolved. That includes 60% of the rapes in the United States go unsolved. And yet there are rape kits sitting on crime lab shelves not getting tested. And if you go to the police and say, why aren't this evidence, why isn't this evidence being tested that you've collected from a crime that has occurred, why isn't it being tested? They will say, we don't have the resources to test all these kids, right? And yet, when you look at their counterterrorism budgets, when there's a much lower level of violence, somehow there's all the resources in the world. So how can half of our population be terrorized and have nobody care, rather than looking at this holistically? Even the murders, a third of the murders in the United States each year go unsolved. That equals about 3,500 murderers a year are walking free. And there's not, this huge effort to try to solve them. And I would imagine that if you started solving the armed robberies, you'd start seeing less rapes. You'd start seeing less murders. And you'd start seeing less terrorism, right? If the FBI and local law enforcement had solved the 2011 murder in Waltham, Massachusetts, a 2013 Boston Marathon bombing never would have happened, right? A triple homicide that doesn't get solved. That year, the Boston solve rate, Waltham is a bedroom community outside of Boston, but the Boston solve rate for homicides was 37% that year, 2011, right? So we have to start looking at terrorism as a subset of the violent crime that we're facing, and working it as a subset, because if we start working those cases and putting these resources into solving those crimes, by chance we're going to come across more terrorists, but by certainty we're going to make all of these communities safer, right? And make, it's interesting now, and here in Minneapolis particularly, have you heard of countering violent extremism programs? So this is the biggest, one of the big pushes the Obama administration has made in counterterrorism, this concept of countering violent extremism. And inside it incorporates this radicalization funnel, right? That if we stop extremism, if we counter extremism, then less terrorists will come out through the funnel. So even though we know this is a completely flawed concept, that the science tells us terrorists don't adopt an ideology and then commit terrorism. The terrorists I worked against, some of them understood the white supremacist ideology. some of them just liked making bombs, and they couldn't tell you what they were doing it for. They just found a crowd that they liked making bombs, and they benefited from it. Others were there because their neighbor was there, and so they came along. You know, it's not this simple process of ideology driving terrorism. But worse, what we know from academic studies as well, research, data-driven research, is that most of the people who have extreme ideologies do not support the use of violence, right? And I found that out undercover in neo-Nazi groups. I mean, these are neo-Nazi groups, you know. They're not exactly the apple pie and flag waving type. Well, they wave flags, but not the kind that we wave. And I couldn't count the number of times when we were out at those sort of events where somebody would come up and start talking to me and say, "Oh, you seem like a nice young man. We'd like to have you come around more often. We print this newsletter. We, have this speaking tour. Who do you know in the movement?" And I would say, "Oh, those guys back there." And they would go, "Oh, son, do not hang around with those guys. Those guys are going to get you in trouble. They're going to get you killed. That's not the way our movement moves forward. We have a newsletter. We can put a suit on you and have you go out and give speeches. You can be much more useful not doing that. That hurts the movement." So if we know that the so-called radicals aren't the ones necessarily supporting the violence, and that the people who are committing the violence aren't hanging out with the so-called radicals, this process doesn't make sense, right? That we're engaging in a program that is trying to counter extremist beliefs, even though that has no effect on terrorism. And what it does have is an effective suppression of political speech and religious activity. And that's a measurable impact that these programs have had that are entirely based on this flawed concept and are justified as a methodology that will bring law enforcement more information from the community. So, the basis of this program is that it is going to create more informants within the community who are going to be bringing more cases to the government with the government's already active use of informants in these communities. And so it's contributing to the suppression of these communities. And I think that's where all of the different groups, whether you're involved in environmental rights, when you're involved in peace work, whether you're involved in Muslim civil rights or civil rights generally, we need to all start working together and realizing that a program that today is suppressing the Muslim community, tomorrow will be suppressing our community, and the next day suppressing the next community. And we have to stand up together against this, because for the community, it's very difficult, right? Because the way these programs are developed, the idea is you get certain, you put out the promise of access and you put out the promise of money to cooperate. So, many of these communities need resources and have to say yes to that. And once they're in, then they're the in-group. And the groups that say, hey, wait a minute, this is stigmatizing this idea that you'll only give us services if we help you find the terrorists, that we don't know, by the way. It's the Ku Klux Klan, they use a burning cross, right? They're call themselves Christians, the Christian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. But there's no countering violent extremism program going into Christian churches and saying, when are you people going to start telling us who the Klansmen are, right? Because that would be offensive, right? Because that's not who we are. That's not our community. Those people we call them extremists for a reason. They're way out there on the fringes. They're not part of the community. Well, it's no different in the Muslim community. And the idea that they can take these handful of cases and tarnish an entire vibrant, incredibly diverse community is astonishing, and is all part of this same game to roll up any Muslim violence or illegality into a big ball of radical Islam. Whether it's because there's a war going on in your ancestral homeland, right? When Ethiopia invaded Somalia, I remember as an Irish Catholic when there were troubles back in the motherland, there was a pull, right? This is the way Americans have always reacted to conflict. We've always gone, whether it's the Lincoln Brigades going out and joining to fight fascism in Spain, the Chinese, the Flying Tigers in China. This is part of growing up in America, the country of immigrants, that when there's conflict abroad, people are drawn to it. And frankly, it's part of being a young man, right? I mean, a lot of young people want to go participate, make their mark on the world. It has nothing to do with ideology. It has to do with the existence of these conflicts. And we can work this two ways. We can use the examples of violence to justify more violence that will only create more violence, or we can start closing down those conflicts, identifying what the political issues at stake are, and resolving them through peaceful means. And then we can stop doing these sting operations trying to find the next kid who might want to travel abroad. So I know I came at you with a fire hose on that stuff, but it came up in the questioning during Todd's talk that how this community can reach out to that community. Your interests as peace activists are their interests. Your interests as environmental activists are their interests, right? They want to be environmental activists. They want to be peace activists, right? They're now in a position of such extreme suppression that they're just struggling to be able to express their own voice. So don't think about it as you going to visit a mosque. Think about it as you're hosting a big talk about conflict. They know a lot about those conflicts, right? They know a tremendous, more than me, about the different factions that are involved in the Syrian war, the different factions that are involved in the war in Yemen, the different factions that are involved in the war in Nigeria. And once we start talking about these conflicts as political conflicts, rather than as Al-Qaeda's there, ISIS is there, and that justifies drone strikes and every other kind of conflict, we're not going to actually ever get an opportunity to resolve those conflicts. And part of what I argued in Senator Cruz's hearing was that this concept he's trying to construct of radical Islam is the path to perpetual war, right? When we fought in World War II, we weren't trying to defeat fascism, right? We were trying to defeat the government of Nazi Germany and the government of Japan and the government of Italy. Because when I was undercover with neo-Nazi groups in the 1990s, there are still a lot of fascists out there, and you don't even have to look to the fringes anymore. Fascist, openly racist parties are being elected to office in Europe and even here in the United States. So, we have to understand that you can't ever win a war against an ideology. You have to understand that these, and I think that's what part of the dialogue is about, is that, there are a lot of entities benefiting from this conflict, from this perpetual conflict. There's a lot of money being spent. And so there is an economic reason to keep these conflicts going, particularly because not many Americans are being killed in them. So it's easy to say, yeah, something bad happens here, sure, more bombing over there, without really thinking about what the consequences are, and without really understanding that you're actually spinning the cycle of violence to a level that eventually is going to hurt more people in the long run. So I would urge you that for whatever your meeting you're having, calling those groups and inviting them to participate in your meeting rather than going in and again, kind of it came up in the questioning about keeping the discussion only about security issues. They're interested in all the issues they're interested in getting good public schools, they're interested in getting clean food and water and clean air. They're interested in all the same things you are, and they're no different than any other human being on the planet. So it shouldn't be that hard to make sure that we're sharing our voices with each other. So thank you. And I'm happy happy to take any questions.
Now we have time for question and answers.
Yeah.
So you can come up here to present your question.
There's benefit sitting in the front row.
Okay.
Two questions. First
Sure.
one really quick. Was Oklahoma City, was that considered terroristic?
So there is no criminal statute in the United States called terrorism, for domestic terrorism.
Okay.
So that was a bombing. It was the murder of federal agents. It was prosecuted as such. And this is simply, I had this on the board. This is the academic consensus definition of terrorism. It's actually 12 paragraphs. And in the heading it says, in the larger explanation of this, there are actually 260 definitions. So we're no closer, this was published in 2011, we're no closer to actually identifying what terrorism is. So the idea of prosecuting it, I think, is dangerous, right? If somebody commits an act of violence, there are plenty of laws on the books to justify trying that person.
You said Charleston wasn't considered.
Right, and there is no way to prosecute that.
Oh.
You know, the FBI's definition of terrorism doesn't exist in a statute that somebody could be convicted of. It's just this definition that's out there. So almost admitting this is a rhetorical thing. Now, where it's dangerous on the international terrorism side is we have created a criminal prohibition against what they call material support for terrorism. And there is legal precedent now that even providing what would otherwise be First Amendment protected activity in an area controlled by a designated terrorist group is a violation of the statute. So if you went into Gaza, where Hamas, a U.S. designated terrorist group, controls the territory, to give peace-building exercises, to give the type of exercise that the woman in the video talked about, non-violent approaches to social change, that would be a crime. In the United States, you would go to jail for that because it would require the cooperation of Hamas in letting you come in and do that. So that is extremely dangerous because you're moving the criminal law into basically criminalizing association with groups the government disapproves of. And, you know, as we all know, over time, the government has disapproved of a lot of different groups at different times that we later, looking back in history, realize, no, this person was an icon. You know, I mean, I'm always fascinated when I hear some politicians say, well, you know, we have a problem with mass surveillance now, but at least they're not targeting people because of their political activity, like Martin Luther King. And it's like, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, they weren't naming highways after Martin Luther King, right? He was considered a dangerous radical. And that's who the government was going after, was the dangerous radical. And now in hindsight, we see what a great human rights champion he was and civil rights champion he was. But today, they're targeting groups like CARE, right? Where CARE is the Council on Islamic American Relations. This is a group that is the largest civil rights group in the Muslim community, representing the Muslim community. And the FBI director, former director Robert Mueller, had an open policy of ostracizing them and saying, nope, you know, we won't have any public interaction with CARE. So it's the same thing as Hoover saying, nope, we can't tell you why, American public, but we're not going to have anything to do with Martin Luther King. Right? Yeah. I mean, it's astonishing that that isn't recognized, that here's a group. The government now has extraordinary powers. If they had, all they need is a reasonable belief that the group was supporting terrorism, and they could seize all their assets. And they never would have to share the evidence. The evidence could remain secret, and yet they haven't done that, which to me, again, as a law enforcement officer, is a clue that if the government doesn't even have a reasonable basis to believe, this is a low standard. A reasonable basis is well below preponderance of the evidence, which is what's used in civil cases, and below probable cause, which is what necessary to get a search warrant. Now, the probable cause I used to search people's place, I didn't have to prove they were criminals, right? It wasn't proof. It was probable cause. It was that I, as a law enforcement officer, believed I had evidence to suggest that they were probably a criminal. It's not a high standard. So if the reasonable basis standard is well below that, and the evidence can be secret, so you never have to actually put it out there to be challenged, this is an incredibly low standard. And yet the government doesn't do that, but they have this policy of openly ostracizing them that casts this shadow over their ability to organize, their ability to raise money, their ability to engage in the crucial work they're doing in that community.
Thank you. Second question, you talked at the end about endless war.
Right.
And the cynic in me, after all the billions of dollars, trillions of dollars we've spent trying to counter terrorism, the cynic in me says maybe there are some people that want an endless war, and that's why we haven't been effective.
Well, you know, if you're manufacturing bombs, you need a lot of them. If you're manufacturing washing machines, you know, it's 10 years before you'll need another one, at least if you're manufacturing good ones. But bombs, yeah, especially if you're dropping them, you're going to need a lot.
But we're not trying to stop it, is what I'm suggesting.
You're right. Well, certainly there are interests that are benefiting from an ongoing
exactly.
conflict.
All right. Thank you very much.
Was it General Smedley? People here will know. You know
Right.
who I'm talking about? The war is a racket.
war is
Exactly.
a racket. This is what I wanted to talk about. We are in endless war, and it's corporations. And I think there are a lot of corporations that make a profit off of this endless war. And that's one reason it's going to be so hard to stop it. Because it isn't just weapons manufacturers, it's the oil companies, the financial industry. There's just all sorts of corporations that make a profit off war. And you know something, when the government and corporations work so closely together, I thought that was one of the definitions of fascism.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And one more thing I want to say, I called the U.S. Attorney's Office after the guilty verdicts for the 3 young Somali men. Because one of the charges against them was that they were going to they planned on traveling to another country to commit murder. And the United States government, and I said this to more than one person, the United States government, through its military and intelligence agencies, has been responsible for the deaths, the murders of millions of people around this world. But they didn't agree with me, so
and it's interesting how afactual this CVE, this countering violent extremism programming is. I was actually at one workshop that they were doing, and they had this video where a father looks on his son's computer and he sees that he has been searching ISIS and he has been searching travel to Syria. And the question then for the people participating in the workshop is, what can we do for this person? What can we have out there to help this person resolve the problem with his son? And they could recognize by my face that I was not all that excited about this type of training. And they said, well, what are your concerns? And I said, here's my concern, is you're framing this as if that's bad. But what if the conversation goes like this? Son, I saw you were looking at ISIS and travel to Syria. What's this about? Oh yeah, Dad, I was reading all about ISIS and I think these are horrible murderers and I'm joining the Navy SEALs so I can go over there and kill every one of them. Oh my gosh, son, let's organize the parade on your way out of town, right? Even though it's the same thing, right? We're talking about inflicting a tremendous amount of violence in a way that we're not actually discussing what is the problem. Yeah, he could say, okay, son, you're not really eligible to get in the Navy SEALs. Oh, but you can be a contractor and go over there and kill as many people as you want. And you'll come back with enough money to go to college. Great. That's perfectly reasonable. But if you're going over to participate in the conflict in someone, even if you want to go over there and join a rebel group, you can go over there and join a rebel group. As long as you're joining one of the right rebel, or correct that, as long as you don't join the wrong rebel groups, right? So you can go over there and hook up with a group that is receiving CIA funding and CIA training and fight to your heart's content, right? You can hook up with a Kurdish group over there, right? The Kurds are in the northwest part of Iraq and eastern Syria, northeast part. And you can fight with a Kurdish group. In fact, the Village Voice just had an article about 2 young Americans who went over to fight with a Kurdish group and came back with apparently no problems at all. But the Kurdish groups are fighting hand in glove with a group called the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, which is a U.S. designated terrorist group. So you can even fight alongside the right terrorist group, and it's not a problem. You can go fight with Iraqi militias that are fighting with the Iranian Quds Force, a U.S. designated terrorist group. That's somehow not a problem, right? It's this very strange system because the frame our government and the public believes about that conflict is not what it actually is. And that's what we have to actually have a discourse about, what is factually going on the ground in these conflicts, so we understand how we can resolve them. Because it's a fight over a piece of land. And like every other political conflict that has happened where there has been tragic loss of life, the quicker you get to that political settlement where everybody can participate. And frankly, it's astonishing in Iraq. And this is true with the reporters as well. I'm always shocked by how little they know about ISIS. Can anybody tell me what year ISIS came into existence? Right? When did you hear them? 2014, right? That was basically when everything turned from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. Now we never hear of Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda's not in the news. It's all ISIS. It's like our original enemy is now fighting against our new enemy. So, none of it makes sense. ISIS actually came into existence in 2006. They declared it a caliphate, the Islamic State in Iraq, during the Iraq conflict. During the time here in the United States, we called them Al-Qaeda in Iraq. How many groups in Iraq called themselves Al-Qaeda in Iraq? None. That was a name we made up because it made sense to our public why we were there, right? So if we talked about this conflict as this is the group that came into being because of our invasion and continuing conflict over there, and now we're going to go back and send more troops and more bombing, I think there would be a very different discussion in the public about what our goals and methods are. But because we're talking about this as something brand new that requires brand new tactics, we can erase that history. We don't have to learn anything from that history, and we can continue making the same mistakes over and over without acknowledging that this is a place that we should have, that we need to understand a lot more about before we continue the conflict. Sorry.
Well, the content of what you have said today doesn't surprise me. I think I've always believed that, but I thought it was because of my paranoia. And so I'm stunned to hear it from you because you've been there. Can you see any reasonable way that our government and some of our politicians could change their thinking and get better educated?
Yes, actually, and that's something I think this community can do, because it's very hard for the Muslim community to go into their members of Congress and explain what's happening when they're the victims of it, right? Because it's just hard for the members to understand, well, are you a victim of this police activity because there's an issue? And, I don't want to really get too close to that, where you can go in, learn about the problem, learn what's happening in these committees. Somebody said that there's an event tomorrow, and then help them, help be their voice. Help them and make sure that your members understand that there are legitimate criticisms of these programs. That this isn't just people who are being put upon who are saying, oh, we shouldn't be singled out. This is the entire community saying, no, we don't want this type of programming. This type of programming is divisive. It hurts all of our communities, and you need to bring it to a stop. I mean, it's interesting how the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice have easy access to these members, and they tell them scary stories, and they tell them that these other programs, everybody loves these programs, and they can, the people who have agreed to sign on, they can bring them and say, see, Senator, these are people from the community who love these programs. And whether those people who they're bringing out actually represent the voice of the entire community is quite suspect. But then they go back to Washington thinking this is just fine. So we have to help elevate the voices of the people who are saying, no, this is negatively impacting our community. And I would make sure that that's at a local level. That's your congressman, but also that you're reaching out to the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and U.S. Attorney's Office and saying, look, CVE is a public-facing program, right? This is something you're doing in the public. We're the public. We have a right to know what this programming is. We have a right to know what the research basis for it is. We have the right to know how you're handling the conflict, the negative repercussions of it, because we're seeing those. And that way, you can start having an effect that will build the momentum behind closing these programs down. And it's mind-numbing because I talk to a lot of people in the government on this, and oftentimes in a closed room they'll say, yeah, we know this program is garbage. We know it's not got any research basis to support it. We know where they've implemented this overseas, it's been a disaster, but our bosses are telling us to do it, so we have to do it. And you can send us all the studies, you can give us all the data, and we're just going to keep doing the programming because that's what we're told to do.
Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Well, I'm probably just adding on to his question, but I'm just wondering when we started oversimplifying this concept, and you spoke a little bit about more of the statistics of where the crime is really happening.
Right.
And I had the lucky opportunity of spending time in Cairo as a teacher during Clinton's era, and I'm not really a history buff, so it was, kind of mind-blowing being over there and learning all the history and then coming back home, and then 9/11 happened and the scare tactic of weapons of mass destruction, and in my mind I'm thinking, okay, weapons of mass destruction, maybe there's World War II weapons that are buried under a bunch of sand, and well, how are they going to use those for weapons of mass destruction? And now Saddam Hussein was doing terrible things to his people by holding their water and so they'd have their farming, they couldn't farm any longer and those kinds of things. But that rhetoric to scare us, so that a lot of us, pre me being overseas, I had no idea that the kind of the history or even paying attention to that politically. But I try to use my common sense at times. So it's just and then now, as of late, hearing people talk about in the media about Muslims and that they're out to get us, and I find it very disconcerting, having gotten this far in my life and being in a very multicultural opportunities of teaching. And I grew up in Montana, and we have 7 Native American tribes, and my uncle called me a Cherokee, so I could get into all these camps, and so it's very disconcerting to hear our media, and we as a public, this obviously this is awesome here. We're learning, and you're sharing some facts so that we can go, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, and really, what is the truth? And so I'm just wondering in Clinton's era, because they did a lot of containment type surveillance of knowing where
Right.
these groups were. Has FBI kind of that type of thing changed post 9/11?
Yes, post 9/11, it's much worse, right? I mean, there's much more of what the FBI does now. What I did was secret, right? I went undercover. Nobody knew. I obviously didn't tell anybody, but I was conducting a criminal investigation. So I was gathering evidence of criminal activity that I would one day say, I'm not really who you think I am. You're under arrest. And then there was this beautiful process our founders created that guaranteed their rights to a fair trial. And this is really, I think, key to it and key to my understanding of it anyway. So I worked about a 8-month undercover operation targeting a couple of anti-government militia groups that were engaged in some illegal manufacturing of illegal weapons, explosives, and machine guns, and went to trial. And the militia groups are different from the Nazis because they have a little better PR, right? Not a lot of people coming out to support the Nazis at the trials, but the anti-government militia groups had a better sort of PR. So there were a lot of people who supported this concept of the militias, and these typically weren't people who were actually friends of the people on trial. They just supported their ideology. So they would come to the trial every day. It was a room about this big. It would have this many people every day, and it created this kind of weird little family, right? Because you're in the courtroom for 12 hours a day every day with these people. And so, they knew who you were, you knew who they were. They saw me testify. But at the end of the trial, there was one guy who all during it was trying to give me literature, handing out pamphlets. Read this, you're wrong, your government needs to do this, trying to convert me into his anti-government views. But at the end of the trial, he walks over to me and he says, I'd like to shake your hand. And I'm thinking, oh, did he lick it? What did he do? But I shook his hand and he said, I came into this thinking that what the government was doing was wrong, but I sat through every day of the trial, and I know that these people were going to hurt someone, and that would have done great damage to my movement, so I appreciate what you did. This is a guy in a leadership position in an anti-government movement thanking a government undercover agent for having infiltrated one element of this milieu and bringing them to justice. But again, that's the strength of our system, that it's a public trial, right? And so when we created Guantanamo, when we created military commissions, we destroyed that power. Again, it was a provocation into the government taking actions against its interest. We forgot that we're actually strongest when what we do is in public. And that, I think, was one of the biggest losses. So what the FBI is doing now, much of it is in secret. And anything that happens in secret without oversight isn't going to go well. And that's a big part of the problem, because on the criminal justice side, the FBI has some independence from the prosecutors, so you have a little bit of a check and balance even within the Justice Department, where the prosecutors could say, I don't like those tactics and I'm not going to prosecute that case. Well, the prosecutors now don't even know about half of what the FBI is doing in many cases. So they don't know. For instance, did you know that the FBI has a racial and ethnic mapping program? Right. The FBI is taking census data and mapping all American communities by race, with the idea, and we got documents with the ACLU, that they read like this: San Francisco memo. Chinese Americans have been involved in organized crime in the past, so we are going to map where all the Chinese live in the San Francisco area. The population, there has been black nationalist violence in the past, so we are going to track the growth of the black population in Georgia. There are there are terrorist groups in the Middle East, so we are going to track the Middle Eastern American population in Michigan. That's literally what the documents say. And the FBI is actually mapping these communities for intelligence purposes. And when we published these documents and complained about the program, the FBI spokesman said, this is no different than a local police officer putting a push pin on a map where a crime has occurred. It's like, no, this is completely different than that, right? This is a completely innocent community that you're targeting, right? Because the FBI, they don't take your tax dollars to create pretty maps, right? They're mapping those communities for a reason. So they know where to do their investigations that are targeting those communities because of this radicalization theory that suggests that people from this community commit this type of crime. People from this community commit this type of crime. Rather than realizing that those profiles lead them astray more often than they actually lead to real criminals. And the real criminals aren't hard to find. I mean, one of the things when I talk to police audiences, I try to get across to them that they look at events like these police shootings as this spontaneous outburst of concern from the community, that everything was fine and then one day they get all mad because, you know, a police officer overreacts or acts criminally or whatever. And, you know, that doesn't represent the law enforcement community. And I'd say, well, no, wait, you have to understand that it's not just that these communities are treated as suspect. You know, in New York City where I live, 600,000 stops were being made every day, stop and frisks. And up to 80% of them were black and brown, even though that's far greater than the populations in New York City. So they're being over-policed, but they're being underserved. In New York City, they're better than the national average. The national average for a homicide solve rate is about 64%. In New York City, I'm going to get this wrong, but it's right about 80% solve rate. So NYPD does a very good job. But if you break it down by community, what you see is if you're a white victim, your murder is going to be solved at a rate of 89%. If you're a Latino victim, 55%. If you're a black victim, 45%. Right? And the Daily News, the New York Daily News broke this down using 2012 data. They went one step further and showed where the resources went. So in Manhattan, for every murder, there's 15 detectives put on that murder. And in the Bronx and Brooklyn, maybe if you're lucky, 3, right? So this is a resource decision. And there could be explanations, right? Maybe the New York mayor could stand up and say, hey, Manhattan is the center of tourism, and if we have unsolved murders in Manhattan, we're going to lose tourists, and that's going to be bad for every New Yorker, whether you live in the Bronx or the Brooklyn, because there will be no jobs. Okay, make that argument. But we need to understand the problem from the data. And the data say that there are communities where the police do not care enough about solving their crime problems. And rather than coming up with these community outreach programs and having nice talks, solve their crime problems, and they will love the police. Quit treating them just as suspects, treat them as citizens deserving of equal justice under the law.
Thank you. And I'll
Sure.
just ask one more. When you said they were starting to map communities, was that an overreach after the Patriot Act?
Yes, that program started, it was a pilot program started in 2006 and it was fully implemented in 2009. So it was implemented under the Obama administration.
Thank you.
So are we really safer when we take our shoes off at the airport?
Yeah.
That's not my question. That's rhetorical. I'm very grateful that you mentioned the problem of rape kits, thousands of rape kits that are sitting in evidence rooms not being processed. It does kind of bring up for me how broad and far-reaching these kinds of principles are. So the Violence Against Women Act, for an example, a lot of my background comes from violence against women, sexual violence, domestic abuse, and such. Louder? maybe I can talk into the microphone. Is that better? I see these principles are far-reaching. You mentioned a little bit about funding when you brought up that issue, and what's really driving this? I guess the question I'm getting to is what's really driving this, and how do we address that issue of funding? So the Violence Against Women Act put billions of dollars into funding programs for women. Most of that money, I would say, went into efforts of prosecution, right? Police, attorneys, court proceedings. A fair amount of it went into, of course, reactionary treatment programs. So it's all reactionary, basically, and does very little to solve the problem. And violence against women is still at outrageous levels. But these programs are presented to us in the terms of protection, right? Same thing with drugs. If you oppose the war on drugs, then you were a drug addict, right? And that type of, we just had that recently here in Minnesota, where the sentencing guidelines, our sentencing commission was reducing the sentences for minor drug offenses to reduce prison overcrowding. And who opposed that? Of course, the police, the prosecutors, the law enforcement agencies. So what incentive do these groups that profit so enormously from these government programs, what incentive do they have to solve any of these issues?
The incentive they have, I firmly believe in the strength of the American public. And, but it takes all of us working on all the issues together to make sure that our politicians and the agencies that work for us are doing what they're supposed to do and not doing what they're not supposed to do. I think part of the divisive political rhetoric that's been in this campaign needs to be addressed, that we need to start talking about how we bring this country together again. And I think Todd said it very well. ISIS wants us divided. ISIS is, here's this group. I think that the strength they attribute to it, the intelligence community, 30,000 people. That's basically how big this entity is, that somehow has us in this state of fear that somehow the United States government is not secure, that our national security is not secure, rather than recognizing that, no, our national security is only secure when every American community is secure from violence, when women are secure from violence, it's not a leap to national security, right? They look at the profile, right? They try to find these profiles. He saw these videos online, or he went and talked about this religious figure, so that means he's a terrorist. What do we know from his ex-wife was that he was committing domestic violence. But we don't treat that as a national security problem. Well, maybe if we did treat it as a national security problem, we would have identified somebody like him before he went out and picked up a rifle and killed 50 people, right? The only accurate predictor, reliable predictor of violence is past violence. So if we start focusing on the violence, we'll make the entire nation more secure, and that is what I think is the definition of national security.
Thank you. I love that response.
It's a difficult problem.
I mean, we all have a stake in this.
Yeah,
That's what it boils
exactly.
down to.
Yeah, and that all our issues are actually the same issue, and that's why we need to work together. And one thing, just because I forgot it, in this radicalization model, one of the things that is often identified, they try to hide the indicators from the public, because every time they bring them up, academics are able to look at that and say, no, that doesn't match the data. So they try hard to keep them hidden or to keep them very vague. They'll say things like alienated. Well, what teenager isn't alienated, right? I mean, but one of the things that they talk about, particularly for the Muslim community, is political grievances. So if political grievance is an indicator of dangerousness, what happens to these groups trying to work to protect the civil rights in the Muslim community, right? That is expressing a political grievance. In one document, they actually say a narrative of Muslim civil rights, of concerns over Muslim civil rights, is the Al-Qaeda narrative, right? So this easy, oh, this is that, even though, you know, I can guarantee you one thing is that Al-Qaeda doesn't really care about Muslim civil rights, right? Al-Qaeda and ISIS kill far more Muslims than they kill anyone else. So it's a completely specious theory, but it harms their ability to secure their rights through their own activism, which is why it's necessary to bring them into our community. We don't need to go into their community, like somebody said, bring them into our community and make sure that we're supporting all of our civil rights, all of the issues that we care about.
Thank you.
You know, I want to thank you profusely for, you know, emphasizing that that there, you know, that the two groups that have been, that are thought of as being terrorists, you know, that have, you know, many times been found out not to be terrorists, as our, you know, activists and people who suffer from mental health disabilities, because I'm so sick and tired of looking at articles in the media that say the mentally ill this, the mentally ill that, and I think I think the government needs to quit wasting our tax money in meetings on C-SPAN, you know, and talking about things, you know, that have already been proven not to be true. And one reason that people with mental health disabilities wind up, you know, going to jail is not because they have committed violent crimes. It's because they're, you know, are not decent places for them to go to. And we don't need our state hospitals back, because they were horrible places to be at.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. Thank you very much for bringing that up, because that's also one of the strange ways this distorted methodology is actually distorting the data. So as many of you know, the FBI has become very aggressive with these sting operations. Todd talked about it this morning. And, you know, I did sting operations. But I had to, under the rules that I worked under at the time, before 9/11, they changed after 9/11, I had to have that reasonable basis to objectively believe this person was engaged in criminal activity, which I found to be a very effective level, right? And I used to tell young agents who would complain about it that, hey, if you can't write down on a piece of paper a reasonable reason for spending the tax dollars investigating this person, there's probably somebody worse out there. You know, go look at the worst person. Don't you know, have to scramble around to find somebody.
We have to learn from our history, because we're, you know, only going to be condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. So now with these aggressive methods, they're going out and as Todd suggested, actually creating a plot. So if somebody says, somebody's online and they put on their Facebook that they think ISIS is just great, all of a sudden, you know, the gears of government get working and they send an undercover either informant or officer there to try to generate a plot, to give them money for a plot, to give them weapons for a plot, to give them ideas for a plot, to give them plane tickets to travel to Syria, to help them get a passport so they can travel to Syria, this kind of stuff. And they tried to do that to Omar Mateen, who was the Orlando shooter, but he didn't bite. Wow, did I do that? Sorry. Wow, scared me too. So who, at that same time, they were targeting a guy who was known to have a long history of mental illness, right? Because it's easier to talk somebody who has some handicap into doing something. In Alabama, they worked a sting operation against a young man who had a IQ in the 50s, right? So, but they're doing this so often now that researchers are finding the level of mental illness in terrorism cases is going up. But it's not because the mentally ill are now becoming terrorists, it's because they're being targeted in these stings. And so it's actually skewing the data, again, because we're lucky that terrorism is a very rare thing. So, you know, when the FBI talks about, I think they're up to about 90 ISIS-related cases since 2014, the vast majority of them were travelers. Right? The majority of them aren't people who are plotting. They're people who are just expressing an interest to travel abroad and participate in a conflict, number one. But there's a high level of sting operations involved where whether these people would have actually done this absent the government instigation is very much up in the air. And you know, not all of them. I'm sure some of them, the person was determined to do something wrong. There are still criminals in the world, but this is still a very low number of cases. So if in this, you know, 90 cases, 15 of them were targeted because they had some kind of or despite the fact that they had some kind of mental illness, that wildly skews the data for that year. And so we have to be very careful that we're holding the government to account, that they're not able to exploit these people just so they have another mark on the board, right? That, oh, look, we solved another terrorism case that when you actually look at it was never a terrorism case to begin with. You know, maybe it was a troubled individual, maybe it was somebody who was going to engage in some kind of criminality. Fine, treat it as that, but don't call it terrorism just to improve your statistics. You know, one case in, another case in Florida, on tape, you know, this is a gentleman who well, he's not a gentleman, he was a bad guy, who wanted to, had for some reason wanted to do harm to a synagogue, and the FBI sends an informant to encourage him and give him a bomb to bring to the synagogue, and then says, the informant, the government agent says, is it okay if we call this ISIS? And the guy says, what do you mean? He goes, well, you know, I just thought it would be cool if we said this was an ISIS thing. And he goes, yeah, sure, if you want to. And the FBI is promoting this as another ISIS case, right? I mean, this is good law enforcement. A person wanted to do some harm and they were interdicted, but the government made it into an ISIS terrorist case that it never was. Right? There's no legitimate government reason for that. There's no legitimate government purpose in having their informant say this is ISIS. All that does is increase the public fear, which is the terrorist goal, right? So why do we have our counter-terrorists helping the terrorist groups increase public fear? It makes no sense.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard a lot about 9/11. In the 9/11 Commission report, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and Mohammed, the mastermind behind 9/11, all say that their animosity toward the United States is because of our support of Israel. Palestine is only 1.4% Christian. The rest is Muslim. And our federal dollars give Israel $3 billion a year. Our Minnesota tax dollars support Israeli bonds. How significant is this in the terrorist world?
I don't know that I can quantify it. You know, certainly the conflict is something that a group like Al-Qaeda is trying to exploit, right? That they know, here's an issue that we know people are already upset about, so we can say we're in solidarity with that, even though Al-Qaeda has not really been involved at all in that conflict at all, helping any Palestinians or contributing to any, really even any violence there. So I'm not sure that there's any sort of direct line to it, other than, you know, conflict tends to spawn more conflict. So if our goal is to reduce terrorism, we need to reduce all these conflicts. And, you know, I tend to believe that that's by creating democratic processes that respect the human rights of all people and make sure that everybody has a voice in their own government. So, you know, certainly to the extent there is conflict, there are groups that are going to exploit those conflicts. You know, as far as the dollars are involved, you know, this is another thing that that's part of this equation is all the foreign aid that we give. You know, much of it military, as you suggested. But so you know, there's data out there that suggests that the United States is the biggest arms supplier to the world. So if our goal is to reduce violence in the world, why is that part of our policy? A lot of our military policy, our foreign policy, where we provide resources to a foreign government, has to purchase U.S. arms. So, you know, it's taking U.S. tax dollars, giving it to a foreign country that then has to give it back to an arms manufacturer to get arms. So if that's the only way they can get foreign aid, what are they going to do with it? Of course, that's going to increase the conflict. So, you know, again, so much of our foreign policy is completely opaque, and we, as James Madison said, need to get that public information out. And we can only do it if we demand it from our local representatives, to demand it from our congressional representatives, demand it from our government. We need to know how this money is spent and how money going to whatever foreign country is actually creating a more peaceful environment for everyone, rather than creating more conflict that is eventually going to create just more conflict.
Thank you.
I'd like to, we alluded earlier to the Patriot Act, and I know under that we lost a lot of protections and civil liberties. And I wonder if you could comment about the subsequent National Defense Authorization Act, which, as a military retiree, I was always trained that you know, the U.S. military cannot be used, the federal forces cannot be used against the civilian population, used for law enforcement or whatever. And it seems like that National Defense Authorization Act just opened that gate wide open and really nullified posse comitatus, and you know, allowing the military to take people off the street, hold them indefinitely without charge.
Posse comitatus is interesting because I, you know, growing up in the military, that was the law, right? We didn't use the military in domestic law enforcement. But the act itself was never very strong, and Congress, it says they cannot be used in law enforcement except by act of Congress. So since the war on drugs, Congress has been constantly giving reasons why the military could be used in domestic law enforcement, right? And then we also have posse comitatus only applies to active duty military. So the National Guard aren't covered by that. So I think what's actually more of a threat is how much the National Guard has changed, right? Where, you know, the National Guard used to be the citizen soldiers, the weekend guys who, you know, the reason we can trust them to do police work in the community during some kind of disaster is that this is Hal from the hardware store and Sally from the ice cream shop, and they know us, so we can be confident they're not going to treat us as the enemy. That's sort of the mentality behind allowing the National Guard to engage in policing activities. But that's not today's National Guard in many ways, right? Today's National Guard, you know, with all the deployments overseas, are combat trained and combat hardened, and also work hand in glove with the active duty military in a way that has distorted the distinction. And particularly where that's true is in intelligence activities. So the door was open during the war on drugs, where National Guard were allowed to do counter-drug work and got involved, where now the distinction between law enforcement and the National Guardsmen and drug work was reduced. So, you know, these sort of categories that were designed to protect us have been somewhat washed apart. And one of the ways they do that now within law enforcement intelligence is through intelligence fusion centers. And I know you have one here in Minneapolis, where all these different groups work together. And I'm not sure if the National Guard is in this fusion center, but they are incorporated in many of the fusion centers, and the fusion centers are all networked. And the fusion centers have access to what's called CIPRNet, which you may know about from the military. It's the military intelligence data network. So again, one of the reasons why active duty military were not supposed to be policing was because they had access to this military intelligence that you didn't, that's used to identify foreign enemies, not to spy on Americans. And those distinctions have all been washed away to where, our government considers some of us their enemy. And particularly when you get into these closed environments like the military, like law enforcement, and read some of these records that whether it's Occupy or Black Lives Matter or environmental rights groups, where they talk about these groups like they're the enemy, and that anybody expressing concerns about these issues must be in league with the people who are engaged in some kind of illegal activity. So I think it's very dangerous that those boundaries have been so relaxed. And
So this is running long, I know. I can't resist this question. I mean, I don't want to put any bad juju on you, but do you ever feel any pressure or any kind of intimidation by speaking out like this?
I started speaking like this while I was still inside the FBI, and there's a reason why I'm not inside the FBI, because the way the problem is framed is not what's really occurring, right? What they always talk about is balancing your civil liberties against security, balancing your privacy against security. Well, if you are not a criminal or a terrorist or a national security threat to the United States, invading your privacy and your civil liberties does not improve security. And I would argue it actually harms security because it gives the information reams of useless, irrelevant information that then becomes very hard to sift. It's not what's happening, right? The Patriot Act, remember, was passed 23 days after 9/11? It wasn't as if they had done a really thorough analysis of what shortcomings existed and what needed to be fixed. No, these were things that the law enforcement intelligence agencies had been asking for years, and were on the shelf, so they all put it all into one big basket and said, yeah, you can have everything you've been asking for, regardless of whether it was actually the cause of the problem. And if once the reports came out, the 9/11 report didn't come out until 2004, and then we realized this was never a collection issue, right? The government had collected all sorts of relevant information about Muhammad Atta, about Khalid al-Mihdhar. They knew al-Qaeda operatives were in the United States. It was that they weren't responding to that information appropriately. They weren't managing the information appropriately. So what we did is we opened the spigot for information without addressing the mismanagement of information. So in every one of these cases where somebody continues to slip through the cracks, what do we find? Oh, the government did have information about him. They had received warnings. They just didn't respond in the right way. So we've created a bigger problem by not addressing what was the actual problem. And actually, I just wrote a piece in Time magazine this week about one of the problems that the 9/11 Commission identified was overclassification, right? That too much information is secret, and even which prevents information sharing within these agencies, even though they all have clearances. If you're an FBI agent, you don't have a CIA clearance. So if there's a CIA document that's classified by the CIA, that doesn't mean that the FBI agent can see it. So they said, this is a huge problem, we have to resolve it. That's the only thing Congress and two administrations now have not touched. And overclassification is becoming a bigger and bigger problem that is harming our national security. So the only reason for the classification system to exist is to protect our national security. And it's harming our national security. And yet nobody will take the bull by the horns and say we actually have to address this problem. And it's fascinating, especially with all the ink spilled on the Hillary Clinton email situation, where we've seen with Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, reams of classified information being put out in the public, right? This is information, some of which could only be marked secret if there is a government official who says the public release of this document will harm our national security. Our national security, right? Reams of that went out. Did you feel the government shake under your feet? Right? Nothing, right? So much of this material, is it going to embarrass the government? Oh, hell yeah. Is it going to show misconduct? Is it going to show government overreach? Absolutely. Does it protect our national security to keep that type of information secret? No. Our government only works through public accountability. That's how the whole system is set up. And if we remove that public accountability, our government's never going to be as effective as it has to be to address all the problems in the world, whether it's environment, whether it's conflict, whatever it is. So we need to make sure that we are pressuring our elected representatives to make sure that we know that the public has public knowledge so we can prevent this grand experiment from turning into a farce.
Can I follow up on this?